Thank you, Nicola. Oh, no matter how many times that happens, it always catches me out. Yes, nice to see you all. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight we have ourselves a guest speaker, and that is Dr. Robert Houghton. Thank you for joining us tonight, Rob. Rob is a senior lecturer in the history department at the University of Winchester. He completed his PhD at the University of St Andrews in 2013 on representations of collective action in the Italian proto-communes, and he's gone on to undertake further work on networks and social political structures in northern Italy during the 11th and 12th centuries, as part of further work engaging with his interests in medieval Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Investiture Contest. In recent years, Rob's also, however, developed a second main research strand based around analysis of the ways in which modern games can be used to represent, explore, and debate the Middle Ages. This work considers the development of stronger teaching techniques through games and their potential as outputs and tools for the study of history. And in relation to this theme, Rob acts as a researcher for several games companies, organises the annual Middle Ages in Modern Games online Twitter conference, and is an editor for the online public history forum, The Public Medievalist. So yes, not sure how you have time to do much else, Rob, but never mind. So tonight he'll be speaking on the theme on the first of these research themes, and with his paper, which is entitled A Very Civilised Rebellion, Mantua and Canossa, 1090 to 1115. So over to you, Rob.
Brilliant. Terribly sorry. Thanks very much, Ian, and apologies there. I had a small panic as I couldn't find the unmute button. Thank you so much for that really very generous introduction. And I should probably emphasise that a lot of the stuff that seems like I've been very busy in the last year has just been built up over preceding years. I do have an occasional social life, and as Ian said, today I'm going to be talking to you about my original research, really, about my work into medieval Italy, into relationship networks. And, well, in particular today, using a lot of maps, because maps are cool. So what I will do is I will share the PowerPoint, hopefully. Oh, okay, so I've completely up. I've broken the sharing, excellent. Okay.
Has it gone wrong?
It's gone a little bit wrong. Let's see. It's like the joys of tech.
No matter how many times you do it, it's always sitting waiting there to catch it.
Brilliant.
This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, you're on mute now, Rob.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Sorry, successfully switched to an app. There we go.
And that's
apologies, everybody. It's 2 years in, and I still can't work the internet. So, as Ian said, as I've said, today I'm going to be talking to you about going all the way back to my PhD, some way traditional historical research. So this is looking very much at what's going on in northern Italy, which I can heartily recommend to anybody because it's a fascinating period. It's a fascinating region. There's plenty of sources, and also the weather is clement and the food is delicious. Today in particular, though, I'm talking about the relationship between Mantua and Canossa between around 1090 and 1115, no, around about it. And it is very much a tale of two cities, and as promised, the first of many maps today. Mantua and Canossa, they're two cities, two locations in the north of Italy, a region which is dominated by a couple of mountain ranges, the Alps to the north, the Apennines running down the Italian peninsula. It's dominated by a range of rivers. See the Po, the Great North Italian River, running very neatly from west to east across Lombardy and ultimately emptying into the Adriatic Ocean. Adriatic Sea rather. There's also some remnants of the Roman world, with a number of passes based along old Roman roads across the Apennines, and also running along Via Aemilia from Piacenza all the way down through Parma, Modena, Bologna, and on to Rimini, Senna, and so forth. So I've said it's a tale of two cities. To be fair, it's a tale of one city and one rather impregnable fortress. This is also a story about Matilda of Canossa. So Matilda of Canossa is a figure who's come to some it will be a great importance throughout this period. It's a figure that's been referenced in popular works over the past centuries. Matilda was, without a doubt, the most powerful, the most prominent secular magnate in the north of Italy over the course of the second half of the 11th century and into the 12th century. She was the Duchess of Tuscany and Spoleto. She was the Countess of Mantua, Ferrara, Modena, Reggio, and Canossa. She may at one point have been the Viceroy of Liguria, this area around Genoa. Beyond this, she held a number of lands, a number of small holdings all the way across Lombardy and Emilia, these areas up to the north of the Apennines. All in all, a very big, very important figure who I'm delighted to say has been studied a great deal over the last couple of decades. There's a number of very important works being recently released, looking particularly at Valerie Eads, Alison Kreber, and David Hay in recent years in the English language, and also Blair Apgar has done a lot of very important work and had recently passed a PhD dissertation. Matilda is particularly important because of her role in the Investiture Contest. So this is the great conflict between the Pope and the Emperor, or a series of popes and a couple of emperors, most notably Gregory VII and Henry IV. Matilda's role within this conflict is very much as a close ally of the papacy, at least to begin with. She's a close confidant of Gregory VII. She appears frequently within her letters. She's accused of having an illicit affair, or it's going to be an illicit affair because it's the Pope, having an affair with the Pope, and so forth. She's presented very much as the key secular ally of the papacy in Italy throughout this period. At the same time, she's presented as the key rival, the key opponent of the Emperor Henry IV in his attempts to take control of Italy, to take control of the papacy, to install his own candidate on the papal chair down in Rome, and ultimately rule as an emperor in the vision of his fathers. Matilda, as I've mentioned, Matilda's legacy long outlived her. And we see this within the Middle Ages itself. Matilda is seen as a patron of many of the North Italian cities which came under her sway. She was buried initially at San Benedetto Polerone, the monastery just south of Mantua, although her body was later dug up and moved down to the Vatican, where she is one of only 2 women interred in the area. More recently, Matilda has appeared as a figure of interest, a character of interest, a recommended character to play in the computer game Crusader Kings 3. Matilda is all over the place, and her legacy is very important. Her legacy is grand and a very important character to look at in her own right and in terms of her legacy. Matilda is also tied into the origin of the city communes. Many of the cities, many if not all of the cities within Matilda's realm, have been presented as becoming autonomous, becoming the start of their communal rule. Their political identity is presented as beginning at the point of Matilda's death. Matilda dies without heirs, has no children who outlive her, and her territories fragment. And the idea is that each of these communes, they break out from what had been Matilda's ironclad bonds and take control of their own futures. This is something that shows up in the narrative of many of these Italian cities, Italy as a nation, and within histories of the papacy and of the empire. Mantua and Canossa are key within narratives about Matilda. So Canossa, as I've said, it's a fortress rather than a city. It's Matilda's family's legacy, going all the way back to her great-grandfather, Adalbert Atto, who sheltered the Italian Queen Adelaide in the castle at Canossa in the 950s, and summoned the Emperor Conrad II down into Italy, Henry II down into Italy to take control of the region, to absorb it into their empire. Canossa is also the site of the family monastery at Canossa. It has a great deal of strategic importance. It sits on one of the key passes through the Apennines. Mantua, on the other hand, is a city in the center of the Italian Po Plain. It's a very well fortified, it's a naturally fortified city. It's surrounded on three sides by the river Mincio, a substantial branch of the Po. It's a center of economics for largely the same reason. It's a key point on the north, south, and east-west trade routes across Lombardy. And it's the administrative center of Matilda's northern domains. This region, which is a city in which her family maintains a palace. It's a city where her family is frequently found. And this narrative is spoilt slightly by the rebellion of Mantua for over 20 years within Matilda's reign. Mantua, this key city within Matilda's empire, Matilda's duchy, rebels against her, starting by turning to the Imperial side in 1091 during the siege of the city, and ending in 1114, where the city notionally surrenders to Matilda. Mantua is one of a number of cities in Lombardy and in Tuscany which move over to the Imperial side during the Investiture Contest, normally as a consequence of the Emperor granting significant rights to the citizens of the city. This occurs in the 1080s in Tuscany, and then in 1090s in Emilia and Lombardy. And these cities are presented as returning to the fold, as being brought back into Matilda's domain over the course of the next 20 or so years. Mantua is one of the last holdouts in this regard. There's a problem with this, though. There's a severe limitation to this narrative. And this is basically that this narrative is drawn primarily from a single source, that of the life of Matilda, the Vita Matildis, written by Donizzoni of Canossa. This is a very limited approach to Matilda's life, but it's one that was echoed in the medieval sources, in the early modern sources, and indeed is still echoed in a lot of narratives written in the modern world about Matilda, about the Investiture Contest, and about the Italian city communes. Conveniently, though, we have for 24 years now, we've had access to the edited version, the edited collation of Matilda's Diplomata, this record of Matilda's charters issued across her lifespan, running to a total of around 145 documents. There's plenty of means now to chart where Matilda was, and we have another body of sources to look at beyond the narrative sources, beyond Donizzoni's Vita Matildis. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing tonight. I'm going to talk about four things in the rest of this presentation. I'm going to first of all talk about Donizzoni of Canossa, provide a little bit of detail about who he was, why he was writing, and talk briefly about the Vita Matildis. Well, secondly, I'm going to move on and talk about the Vita Matildis itself in some more detail. I'm going to look at the ways in which it represents Matilda, or at least I'm going to look at the ways it represents the Mantuan rebellion, and highlight a few shortcomings, a few gaps in the narrative it produces. In the third part of the presentation, I'm going to go on and talk about Matilda's Diplomata, talk about how these can be used to plug the holes, how they can be used to explain the gaps in Donizzoni's account, how they can be used to confirm some elements of this account, but can be used to challenge most of the rest of that account. And finally, I'm going to look at the broader implications, how a reconsideration of what exactly was going on during the Mantuan rebellion, what that can tell us about the rebellions of the other cities within Matilda's domain. So, first of all then, Donizzoni of Canossa. Donizzoni is perhaps not as well renowned a figure as Matilda of Canossa, and in fact, if I look for an image of him, this is the best that I can do. The Italian there, who is Donizzoni of Canossa. Donizzoni was a monk at the monastery of Canossa. He later became the abbot. He was referred to as the abbot of Canossa in 1136 in a document from Pascal, basically confirming the rights of the monastery. Donizzoni, we don't know a huge amount about him. We suspect that he spent the vast majority of his life at Canossa, that he wouldn't have had that, and then therefore have very limited first-hand experience, first-hand details about what Matilda was getting up to. Which, as you might imagine, is a bit of a problem when his main authored work is about the life of Matilda. Donizzoni is very much reliant on hearsay, but also on his skills as an author. Donizzoni has an acute knowledge of ecclesiastical history, but also classical history. He leans on Ovid, on Virgil, on various other classical figures throughout his works. He also leans on biblical traditions. There's no coincidence that his work, the Vita Matildis, is comprised of a total of 40 chapters. Donizzoni really bends the rules of what would possibly count as a chapter in order to get the number up to 40 here. There are a number of chapters which consist of about 8 lines of text. It's interesting decisions there made by Donizzoni. Donizzoni is also very creative in his use of these texts. He writes in a Leonine meter throughout most of his work, but he will quite happily drop in citations, large blocks of text taken from other works, most frequently from Virgil. And Donizzoni is not above making things up, demonstrably so. He talks throughout his work about a number of incidents which physically cannot have happened, given what we know about where people were from the charter sources, the accounts given by other narrative sources, and also in some cases by the sheer laws of physics. Donizzoni then, very talented author in many respects, although his work is, well, it's Italian poetry of the 11th century, and I would not wish this upon anyone. Donizzoni wrote in around 1110 through to around 1116 for his Vita Matildis, so this is right at the end of Matilda's lifespan. And his work encompasses, well, in the first 20 volumes, the first 20 chapters encompasses the history of Matilda's family. In the second 20 chapters, he looks at Matilda herself. This is a relatively standard approach to a Vita, very standard approach to the life of one of these great figures. It's unusual in that it's the only case that we have of a Vita being composed for a member of the Italian nobility, rather than the royal family, rather than the imperial family. In many ways, Donizzoni is a trailblazer, and this gets picked up. This is one of the reasons why his work becomes so widespread. We only have 4 copies of Donizzoni's work extant, but there are over 20 different varieties, 20 different variations of his work, which emerge in the years following Matilda's death across the north of Italy. They're very clearly based on Donizzoni's work. We have the version produced at San Benedetto Poderone, which naturally focuses on the monastery. We have a version produced in Verona, which for some reason makes Verona seem much more prominent than it is in the original account. So it's a hugely important account, and it's been hugely influential on the authors who came after Donizzoni, both in the Middle Ages and in the modern world. When it comes to writing, though, Donizzoni displays a number of traits, a number of motivations. Perhaps most clearly, and one that Donizzoni owns in the first chapter of his work, Donizzoni is writing very much in support of Matilda. And he says as much in the opening lines of his work: if Plato were alive and Maro, so Virgil himself, these times would compel them to compose countless verses about our dukes, the Canossians. This is only to be expected. This is a work all about the life of Matilda. This is the standard approach to using the Vita. There's a few details, though, about the way that Donizzoni goes about doing this. Donizzoni is very much writing in support of Matilda. He uses all the classical ways of portraying a ruler as being fair, as being honest. Matilda is presented as strong, as athletic, as just. all of the usual tropes that these authors you'd expect to see from these authors. In particular, though, Donizzoni is applying these to a female ruler, and this is something that we don't see anywhere near as frequently in this period. In addition to this, Donizzoni presents Matilda in a couple of particular lights. First of all, she's presented as the legitimate ruler of her territories. This is something that Donizzoni goes out of his way to emphasize in almost every single chapter. Matilda and her family came by their territories honestly. They were granted to them rightly by the emperor or by the pope or occasionally by the church. Matilda and her family have every right to these territories, and this is important from Matilda's point of view because she's been placed under imperial interdict all the way back in 1080. Her lands, her rights have been curtailed. They're forfeit. Donizzoni, on Matilda's behalf, is naturally keen to counter this, and he does so throughout as well. At the same time, Donizzoni also presents Matilda in a royal and occasionally an imperial role. When the cities rebel against Matilda, they're presented as doing so in the same sort of language which would normally be reserved for those rebelling against kings or against Roman emperors. Donizzoni lays on the Roman terminology quite thick in his descriptions of the Italian cities as well. He uses cibes, citizens, which, to be fair, is becoming relatively common by the time we get into the 12th century, but also more archaic terms. Plebes appears a great frequency within Donizzoni, and that's a very unusual term in use in this area at this point. And in doing so, well, Reversi and a number of other authors have put forward a strong argument. This is an attempt by Donizzoni to underline Matilda's qualities, but also to present her actions in contrast with the failures of the actual emperor, the Emperor Henry IV. By casting Matilda in the role of a king or in the role of an emperor, Donizzoni neatly finds a way to attack Henry, to declare his actions as unjust, in particular, his decision to revoke Matilda's rights. So, several layers going on just talking about Matilda. Of course, it's important to bear in mind that Donizzoni does have an ulterior motive for presenting Matilda in this light. So first of all, we have all the standard interests. It would not be surprising to think that Donizzoni may be writing, at least in part, to try and secure further donations for his monastery, the monastery at Canossa. More significantly, he may be particularly concerned about legitimizing Matilda's control of her territories, because many of these territories have been granted to Canossa itself by Matilda after she's been placed under imperial interdict. If those lands were to be forfeit, there's a legal argument to be made that that would follow even if Matilda has disposed of them, even if she's donated them to the monastery. Perhaps most importantly, though, Donizzoni is almost obsessed with where Matilda is going to be buried. This is something which he devotes at least 3 chapters over the entire work to. He talks about where the Canossan family have been traditionally buried, and every time he emphasizes it has always traditionally been at the monastery of Canossa. He is attempting to claim Matilda's body for his monastery, even whilst she's still alive. And ultimately this doesn't work. The body is interred at San Benedetto Calderone, but it's clear throughout Donizzoni's work this is the main rival for Matilda's body as far as he sees it, Matilda's grave. He constantly attacks Mantua, and this is all part of an attempt to badmouth monastery down at San Benedetto Cove, just south of Mantua. So, that's Donizzoni. Donizzoni possesses certain attitudes, Donizzoni presents certain attitudes and certain intentions within his writing. And we see this translated to a substantial extent into the narrative he produces around the rebellion and ultimate surrender of the city of Mantua. Mantua appears as the subject of 4 of the chapters of Donizoni's work. The city first appears in Book 1, Chapter 8, so this is going all the way back to Matilda's parents, in this case, the issue of the burial of Boniface of Canossa. As I've said, Donizoni has a rather strange fascination with where the Canossans get buried. And this chapter is couched in terms of a dispute between anthropomorphic personifications of Canossa and Mantua. We have a bit of back and forth here between Canossa, who will come out with some form of insult. In this case, you have the name of city, but not the honour. And while you hold many people, still we know that you live reserved, distant from triumphs, a friend estranged, not aiding others. Even back when he's talking about Boniface, Donizoni is laying the foundations to lay into Mantua for its rebellion, for its subsequent rebellion 50 years later against Matilda. And there's a lot of back and forth here. Mantua boasts about its wealth, about its importance, about being the home of Virgil. Canossa invariably gets the best lines here. The castle insults Mantua for its fidelity, insults it for driving Virgil out. At one point, there's a bit about the cleanliness of the population. It's a fascinating read. More useful for us, though, is Donizoni's account of the siege of Mantua in Book 2, Chapter 4 of his work. So when Henry IV entered Italy for the 3rd time in 1089 rather, he was very much targeting Matilda's northern territories. And after taking a couple of castles and smaller cities, Henry laid siege to Mantua in 1090. The city was defended by Matilda and her husband Welf, the son of Welf of Bavaria, Great Duke in the southeast of Germany. Welf is presented as holding the city, as defending the city itself, while Matilda remained in the countryside and ran interference. She attacked the siege camp. She brought supplies into the city. She maintained control of the rivers. All of this came to an end 11 months into the siege in 1091, where Donizoni reports, "For in the night that Judas the merchant sold out our Lord Jesus," so the night before Easter, in effect, this same city, Mantua, declared surrender. But while the king entered the cruel city, the nobles of the Lady Countess escaped, rescued by her own ships with their property and arms. It's a very clear-cut betrayal. Donizoni takes great glee in being able to use the timing of the rebellion at Easter as a way to drop in references to Judas. He does this a number of times in reference to Mantua throughout his work, but this is perhaps the clearest and most effective use. It's also presented as a qualified disaster. The city falls, Welf is humiliated, as we find in the lines after this, but ultimately Matilda salvages the situation. She withdraws her troops, she withdraws her nobles. Even in the face of disaster, Matilda salvages some form of victory. But this is in 1091. In the subsequent chapter, Donizoni returns to, or devotes a further chapter to insulting Mantua for its dishonesty, for its infidelity, for its Judas-like tendencies, for various other things. In particular, Donizoni emphasizes how strong the position of the city had been, how well fortified it was, how it could last in siege for considerably longer than the meagre 11 months which it managed. Donizoni states, or Donizoni asks rather, "Who does not know, O Mantua, what glory could exist for you, if only you were prudent enough to keep the gates shut to the king? If you had kept the faith, if you were asked to, if you had kept the faith you were asked to for the countess, O Mantua, if you gave your aid to Matilda not only for 10 years but for 20 more, you could have resisted. There was nothing to fear from the enemy." Donizoni sets it out that even the imperial host was not a threat to Mantua. It's a strategic strong point. Mantua then disappears from Donatello's work until 1114, when Donatello presents an account of Mantua once again renewing its infidelity and attacking the fortress of Ribalta. So this is a fortress to the north of Mantua, or along the Mincio, the river which passes through the city. The Mantuans are presented as attacking Ribalta, having heard about the death of Matilda. Matilda taken ill early in 1114, and unfounded rumours of her death circulated towards the end of that year. This prompted the Mantuans to attack her castle at Ribalta, whereupon they were informed by the bishop, Manfred, an ally of Matilda, Bishop of Mantua rather, Manfred, suitably confusing, told the citizens that Matilda was alive and well. Reports of her death had been greatly exaggerated. She was just taking a bit of a rest. This causes a natural panic within the city, where the citizens come to realize that Matilda will descend with fiery vengeance upon their territories. The city will be sacked, they will be put to the sword. At least that's what Donatello says. And so the citizens, they come together, they hold a council, and they agree to surrender to Matilda, which they do unequivocally, without condition, unconditionally. We have Donatello's account, where he says that rumours of Matilda's illness circulated and of the death of the countess. This rumour was believed by the Mantuan Cives, who were wont to believe it, and then promulgated their former treachery to renew their threat and sought out Ribalta. The Mantuans were just waiting for news of Matilda's death to strike, to act when she was gone. And indeed, this line is one of the key things which ties into Matilda's presentation as the only one stopping the rise of the Italian communes. Later, as they go to justify this attack on Ribalta, the populi, the citizens, state that they were subject to a vow, those in the castle of Ribalta, but also the whole, so the Mantuans as well. Such was the treaty to be held while Matilda was alive. It is not violated by taking the castle after her death. So the Mantuans have come to some arrangement with Matilda, whereby the castle at Ribalta will remain sacrosanct. It will remain Matilda's property. And the citizens argue that sacking the castle is justified because Matilda is dead. It's an argument which Matilda takes umbrage at. And Matilda is reported to have approached Mantua at the head of an army, at which point the citizens approached her timidly and asked the pardon of the countess. Matilda held her eyes away from them so as not to hear all that they would have said. The envoys soothed her mind as much as they were able, saying, "We have offended your generous power. We beseech your indulgence. We lay open the defences of the city for you. All the plebs in the city swear to you." And for this pact, Bondeno is known to have acted. So this pact was conducted in Bondeno, a small town right at the very south of the county of Mantua, on the border with Reggio. So that's Donatello's account. It's a very clear-cut rebellion of Mantua in 1091 at the behest of the emperor as part of the siege of Mantua, lasting until 1114, where the Mantuans overplay their hands and outrage the countess sufficiently to march against the city in force. There are, however, a few holes in Donatello's account. A very carefully constructed narrative is worth pointing out. So Matilda throughout is presented as a paragon. She's not only a hugely competent soldier, but she shows mercy. She reluctantly, but she grants forgiveness. She grants mercy to the Mantuans even after they've sacked her castle at Ribalta. Donatello also goes to great lengths to disabuse anyone of the notion that Matilda was to blame the fall of the city of Mantua. He is insistent that Matilda was outside the city when it fell, that she hadn't been involved in the defence of the city beyond supplies, beyond running interference with the Imperial camp. And again, this is something that is typical throughout Donizoni's work. Matilda is never anywhere to be found when there's blame to go round. Throughout the account of the rebellion, Donizoni also goes to great lengths to legitimize Matilda's claims. Mantuans are invariably presented as rebels. They're presented as very much acting illegally. All of their actions, from their betrayal during siege to their sack of Ribalta, are presented as unfounded, as unwarranted. Matilda is also presented in an imperial capacity. She's putting down the rebellion of the citizens. This is something that a Roman emperor would do, something that a German emperor would try to do. The account also centers Canossa. It returns to this back and forth between Canossa and Mantua. It emphasizes Canossa's claim to the rights of burying Matilda. Donizoni is endeavoring throughout his work to tie San Benedetto Polerone to Mantua, to the traitorous Mantua. However, as I've said, there are a number of holes in Donizoni's narrative. First of all, there's this gap in what happens between 1091 to 1114. So Donizoni's work continues throughout this period, but he doesn't mention Mantua at all. This great enemy of Matilda doesn't get a look in for over 20 years. There's also the issue of the treaty, the arrangement around Ribalta. This implies some sort of connection, some sort of diplomacy between Mantua and Matilda throughout this period 1091 to 1114. And this raises the question of what exactly was happening in this period. Was this a period of constant rebellion by the city? Was there a negotiated peace, a negotiated truce? Was the status quo merely upheld? Or was this something which was fabricated by Donizoni as a way of improving the narrative, of improving Matilda's position? It's also worth underlining that Donizoni presents a very sudden surrender on the part of the Mantuans. Bearing in mind that the city had been rebelling notionally against Matilda for almost 24 years at this point. The city is well fortified. It had previously withstood an imperial siege. It seems questionable whether Matilda could suddenly pose a credible threat to the city in 1114. And finally, the choice of location for this alleged compromise, this ultimate treaty, the surrender of Mantua down in Bendena, raises some questions about Matilda's role, Matilda's control of Mantua after this point. Raises the issue of if the citizens of Mantua have surrendered, why did Matilda not take their surrender within the city itself? Why was this negotiated on the very outskirts of the county of Mantua? So, a number of issues with Donizoni's account. And to be fair, many of these have been highlighted by previous authors. However, within the broad strokes narrative which addresses this, they tend to get swept under the rug. We tend not to look at these difficulties within Donizoni's account. We tend to accept them at least when we're looking at the broader picture. To get around this, though, we need to look at Matilda's Diplomata, or we can look at Matilda's Diplomata. And as I've said, this is a series of around 140 charters produced by Matilda over the course of her rule, running from 1071 right the way through to 1115 and her death. And we can do a number of very useful things with these charters. So we can construct relationship networks. We can look at who Matilda was granting charters to, who was involved in the petition for these charters, who witnessed these documents. We can start to construct relationship networks. I've been looking at this over the last few months. I've not included my work on that within this presentation because it is a nightmare to present in 2 dimensions. And also because I've got a large number of question marks next to an even larger number of battalion names throughout that bit of work. The other thing that we can look at, though, which is easier to display and easier for me to get to grips with at the moment, is Matilda's itinerary. We can look where Matilda was, or at least we can look at where Matilda was when she issued charters which have survived to this day. And this is important because, well, places where you are when you issue a charter, places where a king or an emperor, or in this case a duchess, the places where they are when they issue the charter are significant as for several reasons, but primarily as a claim to authority within that location. If you issue a charter within a city, it's a sign that you're laying a claim to authority over that city. And to a certain extent, it's a sign that that city accepts that authority. The fact that you're able to issue that charter in that location says a great deal about your control of a region, or about at least your ability to even make a claim to control over that region. So obviously this isn't foolproof. There are several points where we have disputed locations for the issue of charters. There are several issues around whether issuing a charter is a sign of authority or a sign that or just simply a sign that someone's attempting to assert authority. In any event, we can construct Matilda's itinerary to a fairly substantial degree through the use of these charters, and through that, we can see a number of places where these documents quite neatly align with Donizoni's account. So Donizoni, he talks about Matilda and Welf preparing for the siege of Mantua in 1090, and indeed we find both Matilda and Welf within the city in 1090, granting rights or confirming earlier imperial grants of rights to the Mantuan cives. The charters also conform with Donizoni's account of Welf taking the lead in the physical defence of Mantua, as Welf appears as the beneficiary of a couple of documents issued by the Bishop of Mantua, granting Welf control of the walls, control of various other key strategic sites around the city. Welf is very much being set up as the defender of the city. Ties in very neatly with Donizoni's account. And in 1091, less than a week after Easter, we have a charter of the Emperor Henry IV, which confirmed and expanded the rights of the Mantuan cives. This is very much a formalization of Donizoni's reference to the Mantuans selling out the Emperor. The very effective means of surrender, they're immediately rewarded for it. And perhaps understand Donizoni's anger at the city. And finally, in October in 1114, we can place Matilda in Bondeno. Indeed, Bondeno spends most of the last year of her life within the town of Bondeno. So, to a certain degree, the charters agree with the broad strokes of Donizoni's account, and they're particularly useful because they can help us understand what happened in the intervening period between 1091 and 1114. First of all, though, it's worth underlining that before 1091, Matilda appeared in Mantua with substantial frequency. We have 6 charters which place Matilda in Mantua prior to this point, going all the way back to 1072, the year when she first took power. This would be alongside her mother Beatrice at this point. But in any event, Mantua is very much the centre of Matilda's administration within this period. And in fact, there's no location that has even half, well, there's no location that has more than half the number of charters that Mantua does within this period. Changes drastically after 1091 rather, and when Henry appears in 5 charters, in fact, 2 in 1091, issued within the city of Mantua, the initial one in 1091 to the citizens of Mantua, accompanied by another charter to the newly installed Bishop Guido of Mantua, an imperial partisan. And in 1092, 1093 and 1095, we see further charters issued to Guido or to his cathedral church. This period then, these 4 years at the very least, Mantua is an imperial base. It's one of the centres of imperial strategy within the Investiture Contest. Matilda doesn't return to the region, or at least we don't see Matilda returning to the region within her charters until 1099. But from that point until 1114, when Mantua notionally returns to the fold, Matilda appears in a series of charters issued in towns, fortresses, and monasteries in or around the county of Mantua. Bondeno in particular, as I've mentioned, where Matilda will spend the last year of her life. Bondeno is a frequent site of Matilda to issue charters during this period. We also see her appearing at San Benedetto Poderone, see in the bottom right of the screen there, a couple of times over the course of this period, and various other places, including Guastalla and Novara, these large fortresses, these key fortresses around the Mantuan borders, or in the case of Guastalla, within Mantua, the county of Mantua itself. So Matilda is very active within this period around Mantua. However, she never enters the city itself. And indeed, if we map this, we can see, I should highlight that this map is not accurate to the pixel, but it's sufficient for our purposes here. If we map the locations that we can place Matilda between 1091 and 1114, we see that she's occupied primarily with this region south of the Po, around San Benedetto Poderone. So this area is notionally within the county of Mantua, but it's an area in which Matilda owns significant land, significant territories. We also see Matildine activity around the edges of Canossa, around the edges of Mantuan territory, just to the west of the river Uglio and to the east of the Tartaro. The two rivers basically provide the boundaries of the county of Mantua. The one exception to this is Governolo. This is a fortress, or at least, yeah, it's a small fortress towards the end of the miniature where it meets the Po. And this seems to be a strategically important point. Matilda seems to have been attempting to maintain, possibly hold against the Mantuans. To put this bit of context, also Rivolta, as you can see, is pretty distant from these areas of Matildine activity. Matilda's not getting anywhere close to Mantua itself. She's not getting anywhere close to Rivolta. These seem to be no-go areas for her, at least as far as the charter record is concerned. Just to put this in a bit of context, I've also charted the locations in and around Mantua where we find Matilda issuing charters between 1072 and 1091. We see a substantial change in Matilda's patterns, Matilda's behaviours after 1091. It's not simply that she's withdrawn her activity from Mantua itself. She's started to concentrate her activity much more strongly within the county, but to the south of the Po. It's a reasonable assumption, or at least I think construct a very strong argument, that this shift is reflective of Matilda's attempts to counter the autonomy of Mantua, of her support in particular for the monastery at San Benedetto Poderone, which becomes the recipient of a significant proportion of Matilda's charters after 1091, but also a way of marking her authority over laying claim to this area to the south of the Po in a way that she perhaps couldn't to the north. And as I've mentioned, between 1114, between the surrender of Mantua in October 1114 and 1115, Matilda seems to be located only in Bondeno. There's an argument that she may have issued a single charter from San Benedetto Poderone about 10 miles up the road, but that's based largely on the recipients of the charter and the fact that it's not explicitly stated where the charter was issued. At the very least, Matilda only really appears in this very small area in the south of the county of Mantua in this period. So this suggests a bit of a divergence from Donat-Zoni's account. Or at least Matilda's charters suggest a bit of a divergence from Donat-Zoni's account. Matilda doesn't issue any charters in Mantua itself. This is in stark contrast with what we see after 1091 with the Emperor Henry IV. He almost immediately issues a pair of charters stating his claim, stating his authority within the city. Matilda does no such thing in 1114, which suggests that maybe her authority over the city was perhaps not as absolute as Donizzoni would have us believe. We also see no engagement with the Cives by Matilda following this point, and again this is in stark contrast with Henry's actions immediately after the siege of Mantua in 1091. Brilliant. Just thinking about a time check, so we shall move on to wrap stuff up. See a very significant distinction between what Matilda is doing in 1114 and what Henry had done in 1091. We see no evidence of Matilda ever going north of the Po. We've seen no evidence that she was ever anywhere close to Rivalta, going all the way back to the 1080s. Oh, sorry, going all the way back to before the siege. And also, while Matilda mentions Manfred, Bishop of Mantua, in many of her charters, we see no sign that Manfred is actually present in Mantua until 1136, long after the death of Matilda. Donizzoni's account isn't really supported by the charters, and in a number of places there seem to be broad-faced contradictions. We can construct a very brief outline then of events in Mantua between 1091 to 1115. In the early years, we see Mantua being used as an imperial base. After 1099, we see Matilda starting to act around the periphery of the county, and we see this continued after the notional surrender of the city in 1114. There's a possibility that there was an agreement made in the late 1090s that Matilda would occupy herself in the south of the county, and the rest would be left to its own devices. This activity also suggests that the surrender in 1114 was a truce rather than an abject surrender. We see no indication that the citizens of Mantua took anything back, or gave anything back to Matilda after this point. We see no evidence that Matilda was able to exert any sort of control over the city itself. Very swiftly then, we can look to some broader implications. Because after all, this is just the single example, this is a single city, and I'm acutely aware that a lot of what I've been talking about has been an argument from silence. What I'm going to do very briefly at the end of this last section then is demonstrate that this silence is deafening. As we can look at the various other cities which rebelled against Matilda, and which Donizzoni says were defeated, were submitted, besieged, and so forth. And each of these cities, well, many of these cities appeared in Matilda's charters before the year 1080. None of them appeared between 1081 and 1091, aside from Mantua. And in 1099 to 1107, there's just a handful of these cities which appear in Matilda's charters. Matilda seems to have been unable to return to these cities after their initial rebellion. In the case, if it's just a single city or just a couple of cities, we could write this off as an accident of the survival of documents. But the fact that the vast majority of her urban territories appears to have refused their entry after their initial rebellion raises a lot of questions about whether these cities ever actually returned their fidelity to Matilda in any meaningful capacity. It's also worth highlighting that the vast majority of the bishops that Matilda selected for these cities were never able to take their position within these cities. So Bernard of the degli Uberti over in Parma gets sent over to the city in 1104, gets immediately kicked out, or gets immediately imprisoned by the Parmans. Matilda notionally shows up, secures the surrender of the Parmans, who release Bernard, but then Bernard disappears. He appears again in 1106 when the Pope Pascal comes to consecrate the new cathedral at Parma, but he disappears again. He only appears in 1122 down in Parma. And this is something we see repeatedly across Matilda's territory, both in Lombardy and Emilia and down in Tuscany. So, to wrap things up very quickly, and thank you for bearing with me here. We can point to a number of distortions in Donizzoni's account of the siege, the rebellion, the surrender of Mantua. This is to be expected. We can also highlight a number of limitations of Matilda's power in Mantua and the surrounding area after the city's rebellion and even after the city's surrender. We can also point to a broader range of limitations of Matilda's power. moves from being a ruling primarily through the cities to ruling primarily through the countryside. And this is a key point. This is something that we really need to emphasize, because this drastically alters our understanding of the nature of Matilda's rule, her control over the cities, and how exactly the political system of northern Italy actually functioned. Also raises the issue of when the Italian communes gained a degree of autonomy. Normally we see this dated to around 1115, but seeing fairly substantial evidence that we can push this back by 2 or 3 decades in a lot of cases. And finally, it highlights perhaps one of the problems with our broader approach to Matilda of Canossa. Investigating Matilda has produced a huge amount of very important history over the last few decades. It's shifted the focus quite substantially away from this old great man history, which is this approach which focused on the emperor, which focused on the pope, focused on a few key men. However, we're in danger of developing instead a great woman history, where Matilda is presented as exactly the same sort of hero that Henry, that Gregory were presented as, these all-powerful figures. Perhaps time to move to a great city history. So thank you all very much. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was excellent. Yeah, great stuff. And I suppose reinforcing, as always, with historical investigation, that just because our sources tell us one thing doesn't mean that that's anything like a reality. And I suppose re-emphasizing again that it's only through constantly reanalyzing what's accepted and reinterpreting it that we actually get perhaps closer to some sort of reality. Okay, we've got a few minutes for questions then. I think with the audience being the size it is, I'm happy just to let folk just come in if you want. So yeah, does anyone have any questions for Rob? And you come, Colin.
I'm just wondering, I've been to Mantua a few times. Northern Italy's my wife's favourite place, so we tend to go there on holiday. So I have visited, and so I did a little bit of reading before I started studying history, and I read mostly Napoleonic. And one of the things I noticed was that they suffered quite a lot from disease in Mantua, especially malaria in certain seasons. And I was just wondering whether that could possibly be a reason for the surrender. They did have that issue during Napoleon's siege, and it could explain why they had to have the agreement away from the town.
Yeah, this is a really good point. I've got to be completely honest with you, Colin. It's something that's never actually occurred to me, but makes perfect sense. You're absolutely right. So, yeah, Mantua has, well, until very recently, had ridiculous problems with malaria, much the same way as Rome. And I think that the issue is, well, yeah, surrounded by water, some of which is likely to be stagnant. What I would say, I think, if anything, that might play into the so it might play in favour of the city, the defenders, rather than the besiegers. What we see in Henry's previous campaign down to Rome, he spends 4 years besieging the city of Rome, and basically it comes down in autumn, lays siege to the city, spends winter, spends spring there, but in the summer he retreats up into the mountains because, well, malaria arrives and nobody wants to be around there, particularly if you're German. And that's, I'm wondering, I think you could be making a very good point there. That might play into Henry wanting to end the siege through negotiation rather than through force. If anything, I would have assumed the army outside would have had worse conditions, would be more likely to be hit by malaria than the city. But equally, that could be entirely wrong. I'd love to. I'm going to have to go and do some more research, but thank you so very much for that. It's brilliant. Cheers.
Sorry, I've only read a little bit about Napoleon. I'm not even sure who suffered the most, but where the siege works were. Although there's still a doorway in Mantua with a cannonball in it from the siege at the time.
It's great. I mean, we were saying we were having a little conversation before we started up here. It's basically a map of Italy with all the varieties of pasta and interesting things to see. And so why would anybody not want to study this?
Yes, who would want to study medieval Scotland, I ask you. Other questions?
Really nice.
Yes. I'll come up with one. I like that idea at the end of challenging what might be perceived as a great woman history. And I know quite a bit has been made of not treating various specific historical female characters as being exceptions. And whether that, I suppose, whether that aligns with that or not is perhaps another question. But I suppose is that how you see Matilda having been depicted in her afterlife? That she has come into that category of the great woman, because some of the stuff that obviously is in that chronicle is very symptomatic of that. I mean, you said yourself that those allusions to her being kind of an emperor type figure, but even the acceptance of the surrender, and the envoys having to placate her and her showing magnanimity. That sparked off in my mind Edward III receiving the surrender at Calais. It's a very obvious kind of parallel. So I mean, is that how you see she's been depicted after her death?
Yeah, I mean, I should underline I've been making very broad strokes assertions for a lot of this, which is partly the nature of it, and partly because this is something I'm returning to after a couple of years away doing computer games. But I think this is exactly what you're saying there, Ian. I got into a lot of trouble. Matilda died 1115. There were a whole load of events back in 2015 commemorating the 900th anniversary of her death and her memory and so forth. And I showed up and I said, "Oh, well, I'm not here to bury Matilda, but yeah." So I appreciate I'm speaking to a different audience here who will possibly be more receptive to bad mouthing Matilda a little bit. I think what's happened a lot with Matilda, she's been okay. First of all, Matilda, by all accounts, exceptional historical figure, clearly hugely important within the investiture contest, within the politics, the diplomacy of medieval Italy. There's a semi-realistic theory that she might have been getting lined up to lead a proto-crusade over to the Holy Land before everything went sideways for the Pope in the 70s, the 1070s, sorry. But yeah, we've tended to fall into a lot of the same traps talking about Matilda as a lot of the 19th, 20th century historians fell into when talking about any given great man. Where it's like you say, yeah, Edward III gets presented as a god among men, and for a while, yeah, a lot of 19th, 20th century historians, they just follow that, they replicate that, they provide some interesting bits and pieces, but mainly about how does this make England great. And we see something very similar with Matilda, although it's split between the papacy primarily saying, well, Matilda was great. She said she was going to leave us all her lands. She protected Gregory VII. She showed Henry IV who was boss. All of these bits and pieces. So she becomes this larger-than-life character, quite literally, with her tomb, with this massive statue, which is about twice as large as I am, and I am not a small person. And this legacy just becomes so much larger than she was. And it's important to talk about Matilda, but it's important to read into it a bit more and not just accept what Donizzoni is saying about her, because the reality seems to be a lot more interesting. She's not the Superman figure. She's having to deal with a lot of very unfortunate situations, and she's maneuvering her way through them remarkably flexibly, which makes her a much more interesting story than, oh yeah, she's like this Wonder Woman saving the Pope. There we go.
Oh, thank you for that, Rob. Time for one more question then. Oh, if not, I shall wrap up. You've sent me off now, though, having being involved in research that is looking of women and more that I now feel bad. I don't know enough about Matilda of Canossa, so I'm gonna have to go and read up on her now, even though it's several centuries away from where I'm studying, but it's still useful context. So thank you for that, Rob. Thanks very much. That's fantastic stuff, and there's some thanking comments in the chat as well. So yeah, that's great. If it's all right, I'll just wrap up with intimation of our next talk. Firstly, sorry, thanks to Rob for giving the talk. Thank you to Nicola for providing IT support. And our next talk, I think, I'll correct me if I'm wrong, Nicola, but it will be on Thursday, the 10th of February. And will be given by the artist Sue Jane Taylor, who will be speaking on the theme of North Sea energy and artist's perspective. Further details for the talk, as well as a link, are available already on the Centre for History website. And hopefully then we'll see lots of people for that one as well. But otherwise, unless Nicola was to stop me because I'm wrong, no good. Then I shall let you all go. Thank you all very much. Thanks again, Rob. Good to see you. And we'll see you all again. Okay.
Thank you, Ian. And thank you all for coming and for humouring me. Cheers.
Cheers all. Bye bye.